Apartheid was a racial segregation system in South Africa that was officially established in 1948 and lasted until 1991. Blacks were the majority in the country, but they were overruled by white supremacy and were treated unjustly. They faced all types of segregation, from different bathrooms to different rights. It was an age of disaster for their community and resulted in constant fighting and protests to end apartheid. This is when the anti-apartheid movement took place not only in South Africa, but around the world. With this being said, we can raise the question of, were domestic or international nonviolent actions more effective in abolishing apartheid in South Africa? What were domestic actions? Domestic actions were nonviolent tactics associated with boycotts, protests, strikes, sit-ins, and speeches led by the South African people. On the other hand, what were international actions? International nonviolent actions can be identified as political and economic sanctions and bans from international committees such as sports events and other associations.
At United Nations headquarters, the Security Council places on its agenda a discussion of South Africa's apartheid crisis. Ambassador Lodge repeats the United States position, regretting the tragic loss of life in recent incidents, and votes to hear the charge raised by 29 member nations that the crisis has grave potentialities for international friction.
How did apartheid begin? The first traces of white supremacy can be seen in the early history of South Africa. The Dutch came and began exploiting South Africa's rich natural resources, which led the country to get under the control of whites. Then, South Africa was under British control due to the gold and diamond mines, which caused the British to have control over the country's economy and other important factors. This demonstrates the first installation of white power over the vast majority of the population in South Africa, which consisted of blacks. This is able to give insight into the first time blacks were under complete white control, which resulted in the ideology of whites being superior to blacks, and then this will be later integrated into South African society with the apartheid system. Therefore, it is important to evaluate why international movements were necessary to abolish apartheid. This secondary source, named The African File, talks about how the international community responded to the movements against apartheid. For instance, many countries gave political and economic sanctions to South Africa as a way to pressure them into abolishing apartheid. Many countries also broke or reduced political ties with South Africa. This means reducing diplomatic relations and implementing sanctions on the military and science of the country by prohibiting the exchange of information and technologies with the sanctioned country. The international community also imposed economic sanctions, which came in the form of trade and financial restrictions. The trade restrictions meant that South Africa's economy was endangered as well as its political status. Countries did not want to associate themselves with South Africa because it was seen morally wrong. This manipulated the amount of capital that South Africa produced because its economy was slowly worsening due to the sanctions from the apartheid implementation. Moving on to national anti-apartheid movements, two primary sources can be used to understand the influence the national movements had on the abolishment of apartheid. The first source is a letter sent by Nelson Mandela to Hendrik Verwoerd, who was South Africa's Prime Minister at the time, which begins by stating,
"I refer you to my letter of April 20th, 1961, to which you do not have the courtesy to reply or acknowledge the receipt."
The previous letter demonstrates how the government ignored ANC's, Africa's National Congress, attempts to work with the government. Therefore, they were forced to take action by encouraging and organizing peaceful protests across the country to demand a new democratic constitution.
Demonstrations against the South African government's strict apartheid policies flare into shocking violence. At Sharpsville, an industrial township, thousands gather outside a police station in protest against new laws requiring every African to carry a pass at all times. The crowd refused to disperse and began stoning the police, who opened fire into the crowd from behind a wire fence.
In this video, you can see the domestic movements that were carried out in order to abolish apartheid. Here, one can see the way black South Africans protested in Sharpeville, South Africa against the loss of apartheid, which did not treat them as citizens. This video shows how the protesters were acting peacefully, but later policemen arrived and enforced violence. This was just one of the many events that were happening throughout the whole country, and it caught the attention of everyone in the country and to an international scale too, which forced the government to start listening to the people of South Africa. Both international and domestic nonviolent actions were a huge contribution to the anti-apartheid movement. However, international actions were more effective than the domestic ones for the apartheid movement because they had a bigger impact on the South African government. The international pressure South Africa was facing caused them to consider the proposals for the apartheid movement to stop. International protests brought more political and economic problems that could not be ignored. In conclusion, it is important to evaluate the nonviolent actions during the anti-apartheid movement because it is clear that they were very influential. Hence, it is appropriate to say that violence is not always the answer. The people from South Africa and around the world carried on with their peaceful ways of protesting the apartheid regime, which resulted in the end of it.